Hello and welcome to the Rubber Duck Dev Show. I'm Chris.
I'm Creston.
And tonight we talk about the dark side of open source. But before we get into that fun, let's talk about the work week in review. What'd you do this week?
So from last week, a lot of what I spend my time on is Ruby 3.0 upgrade for my apps. So like I mentioned in previous episodes, I definitely wait a while. In this case, I waited a year from the point at which a new version of Ruby was released till I'm actually live on it. And as of now, all my apps are now live on Ruby 3.0. But, the process of going through that is basically switching over to the version of run your tests and see what works, doesn't work. Can you start the server? Can you start a console, etc. And usually there's a number of gems that haven't caught up. Now, after a year, they've pretty much caught up or they're not catching up.
Right.
So, and specifically, we're going to talk about here, part of the dark side of open source is kind of how we got the idea for this post, is some of the gems I had to deal with and said, oh, geez, what am I? And namely, with CSV uploads that I had to deal with for parsing. So kind of wanted to, or Excel document parsing. So kind of wanted to talk about that. But that's pretty much, and there was some consulting that I did, some little jobs, nothing major. But basically the big project for the week was moving on to Ruby 3.0. So what about you?
Cool. Well, I got my big refactor done and out of the way finally. So got that up and got it first round of engineering review. Had a few little nitnoids to address this morning, but it's about ready to go to the dev test environment, which is nice. So that feels good, getting that out of the way. And a bunch of little elevated support ticket things and dealing with our big client and meetings and meetings and meetings and meetings and meetings. But, sometimes you just have those weeks. But yeah, I'm actually looking forward to getting into more of I'm working some more on project management flow, information flow, system design stuff for the company. So that's kind of fun.
That's cool.
Yep.
And I mean, some of the other stuff I did this, I've been spending a ton of time really the last number of weeks. It's not related to the Rubber Duck Dev Show, but marketing for a particular product. I've been spending an inordinate amount of time doing that, but that's just business. It's not related to programming and whatnot.
Yeah, and I'm getting ready to do my taxes and
Oh yeah.
Oh,
a little bit of bookkeeping.
Somebody give me a fork to stab in my eye. All right. So on to the dark side. Welcome to the dark side. That's my horrible Darth Vader impression.
Yeah, I know, you're a little bit of hyperventilating there.
You should get a brown paper bag or something. Anyway, so before we get started with talking about the dark side of open source, I just want to preface this with, I love open source. I love the open source movement. Both of us use it a lot. I've been using it my entire career. I've benefited from it. I've tried to contribute some to it as much as my little brain can be useful in it. And it's, I think open source is not a bad thing. It's a fantastic thing. So let's just get that out of the way.
Here.
But there are some things that you need to be aware of, and some things that sometimes happen that can be problematic with open source, more so than problematic with closed source products. Now, there are a lot of commonalities. I mean, both of them can have problems for sure. Both of them can sometimes have the same problems, but open source doesn't necessarily mean you're safe, right? So when we point a lot of this stuff out, it's going to be from a perspective of sharing the information and the experiences with you so you know kind of what to look out for and what to be prepared for when you're evaluating and integrating open source code bases into your stuff, especially if you're doing it in a business environment, because if you're just doing it in a funsies project, none of this stuff really matters. But if you're doing it in a business environment, there are some things that you really want to try to be careful of. So let us first talk about some of the potential issues with open source, and we will start with your wonderfully fun discovery this past week.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, upgrading to Ruby 3.0, ran the tests, and all the things that were failing were related to CSV parsing or Excel document parsing. So I was like, okay, what's up with that? So it was basically, I use the ROO gem, ROO gem, which is a Ruby library. And I went and looked it up. I wasn't on an old version. And then I looked at the issues tab for GitHub, and I see all these issues saying, please release a new gem, please release a new gem, please release a new gem. Is this going to be compatible with, Ruby 3.0? Or, a lot of this, I was like, and these are months old. So I'm thinking, oh boy. And then there was even a post in the issue tag was, is this gem abandoned? So I'm thinking, oh geez, this is a whole lot of whole lot of stuff going on. So I looked at it, I was like, so now at this point, I had a couple of different thoughts. I'm like, okay, I could just, can I find a viable replacement? Usually that's the first thing I think about, because looking at it, it looks like, all right, this is probably, that's usually my first thing I do. Is there a replacement if it has clearly seemed abandoned? And it may not be abandoned, but I saw different references to say people that were supporting it. Someone reached out to them. They said, oh, I don't have time for it anymore or something. So it looks borderline abandoned, although there seems to be great interest in it. And there's a place you can go and look at ratings of different gems, and Rue is pretty high up there still for working with CSV files. So I was like, all right, so basically I started looking for a replacement, because the other thing I could have done is actually participate and start joining the open source community of Rue and building towards making it better. But because of this other gem I found, I decided kind of not to take that route, because that would be a big, I don't know how much of a commitment, but it would definitely be a bigger commitment than I would be accustomed to in terms of my experience with open source stuff. So basically, I did some Googling, looked at the gems available, and I actually found upon one that was called XSV. And it's called XSV because it works with, all right, let me take a step back for a second. So what was great about Rue is that you could give it a CSV file, you could give it an Excel file, and it automatically is able to parse it and work with those files with the same API. In other words, the same type of calls you make towards it. Well, I knew Ruby, the recent versions of Ruby have CSV capabilities built in. And a lot of the gems only focus on doing, or some of the gems I discovered only work with the Excel files. So I'm thinking, okay, well, I can do CSV with pure Ruby, and I can use one of these gems to do the Excel document parsing. So I actually found a gem that only did that. And it was actually fine-tuned for blazing speed. And this is exactly what I was looking for. So it's called XSV. It's called XSV because it works with XLSX files, the open source format of Excel, not the old binary XLS format. So that's where the X comes from. And it's supposed to be like a replacement for CSV. So instead of comma separated variable, they're kind of calling it X separated variable. So it's basically a way to just parse a simple sheet as fast as possible, basically rows and columns, parse it and get it loaded in. And that's exactly what I need it for, because I'm basically supporting people being able to upload different records in different places by giving me either a CSV file or an XLX sheet. So that was perfectly.
God, I hated when they added that extra X in there. That
I
made it
know,
so
I know,
hard to
I know.
say. Frickin'
But
Microsoft.
that made it a perfect replacement of what I was looking for. And it was much faster than the others. So overall, I'm happy with my decision to kind of move to this new gem. And of course, it was Ruby 3.0 compatible. And yeah, the only downside in terms of making the transition was I wish that the APIs between Ruby's CSV and XSV, the API that they chose to go with, were more similar. I was able to get them working using 95, 99% identical code, but there was a little bit that was, yeah, a little bit different. So I had to rework some things, but 99% of the code is identical, using the same code paths, whether you're doing an XSX import or a CSV import. Maybe I should just call it an XSV import.
Just call it Excel. That's what I ended up doing. Because I just never could say that. For some reason, that was just a tongue twister.
So that's kind of the path that I choose to go. That I chose to go, basically.
And that illustrates one of the potential issues with open source, which is project abandonment. So, you know, that can happen. That's not always catastrophic, but you know, if there's a gem that you've been using for years and you've got a lot of stuff built around it, and it's a core part of your app, and all of a sudden it's abandoned, and then you've got a Ruby upgrade that it's not compatible with, now you're kind of in a sticking place. So yeah, with open source, you could get the source yourself and modify it, right? But if you're in a business environment, that's a big time commitment. That costs a lot.
I mean, you're gonna get your manager to approve something like that.
Yeah, right. You know, so it's not a small thing when a project gets abandoned like that you're relying upon. Now, I'm not saying that the people who do open source owe it to somebody to keep that project going forever. I mean, they've got this is a labor of love, basically. It's a gift. So, you know, they don't owe that to anybody, but it's something you need to be considering when you're looking at putting things into your app. If this thing just gets abandoned, am I going to be able to deal with that? Another potential concern with open source is legal exposure and security compliance concerns. Because if you're depending on an open source plugin or gem or whichever thing you're using, and they do an update that ends up causing a leak that gives you some kind of legal exposure. Let's say it exposes. Let's say, for instance, you have Devise for your authentication, and for some reason Devise puts out an update, and all of a sudden it makes all the passwords in your database plain text, right? And just exposes all that stuff. You've got to, if you're a business that has customers that interact with your stuff, especially if you've got customers that pay through your site, you've got a massive problem at that point. So you have to be really careful about that kind of stuff. Sometimes that doesn't happen a lot, but it happens. I've gotten things before where in some open source code where the maintainers made some changes, and they were significantly breaking changes that they put out, and they didn't have any heads up or any kind of branch path or something like that, and it was just boom, everything doesn't work. So I'm back on this, I have to roll back a version,
Right.
which is fine until I have to upgrade Ruby or Rails or something else, and that
But
old
then you're
version no longer works.
yeah, and then you're faced with the question, all right, what do I do about this? Do I, participate in it to try to make the necessary changes? Do I abandon it, find something else, etc.?
Right. And there's also hacking issues that happen. For instance, in 2014, OpenSSL was hit with that heartbleed problem, that hack. That was a big deal. That cost billions of dollars, and it caused all kinds of problems for a lot of companies. And just 2 months ago or so, we had that Log4j hack problem. So this stuff isn't limited to Ruby or Rails or plugins. This happens in Linux. It happens with JavaScript.
Windows.
It happens with everything. Anything that's open source is subject to this issue. But
And actually, that the other interesting thing, at least about this gem in terms of the security concern, is that there are the package manager for gems that most people use is bundler. So it bundles things up, and you can use the command bundle outdated, and it will show you your outdated gems. Well, if this gem is not coming up on bundle updated because you're on the most recent version, but yet it hasn't been updated in forever, so it doesn't work with recent versions of Ruby, etc.
right.
And then what if there are a lot of security releases for things that have to parse things. Like, for example, the XML parser or HTML parser most used in Ruby is Nokogiri, if that's how you pronounce it. I don't know if I've ever heard how it's pronounced.
Yeah.
But Nokogiri. And I probably have updated that gem more than any other gem in my projects due to all of the security issues that have been made because of it. Because again, you're parsing HTML, XML, things are very complicated. Well, I think some of some of these gems like Ru rely upon it, on that gem. So are there hidden security issues, the fact that it hasn't been updated in however so long?
Right. Yeah, and sometimes that's hard to keep track of. Bundler has a lot of nice things in it, and other platforms where it'll kind of monitor for CVEs and give you reports if there's a CVE reported and say, hey, this gem needs to be updated and stuff like that. But it can't catch everything. So if like if Ru has been abandoned for 5 years, nobody's going in there and reporting CVEs for Ru for the most part. So you don't even know that there's an issue or an exposure. So you want to be careful about, even if you're reliant on automated systems to kind of keep you up to date with that kind of stuff, you still want to go and check the repositories every once in a while to see, all right, this hadn't been updated in 3 years. Maybe I better start looking for some alternatives to this before I get backed into a corner here. At least start developing a plan if things go sideways with it. Now, some stuff doesn't ever need to be updated. I mean, there are gems out there that haven't been updated for 10 years, and they're perfectly fine because they're doing some innocuous stuff. And they're not really dependent on Ruby or Rails in particular. Or, they're dependent on such ubiquitous things that they don't care if it gets updated. But for the most part, you want to see some kind of movement on gems, even if they're just being repackaged for new versions of Rails or new versions of Ruby or something. So be careful about those things. And those are kind of the broad stroke issues that you might run into with open source stuff, the things that you want to think about when you're investigating an open source product for use, especially in your business.
And I think we should also add that, this applies to closed source too, because there's plenty of products that become abandoned.
Oh yeah.
And then the problem, if they're closed source, is you're really up the creek without a paddle
Oh yeah.
because you don't have the source code. So your only alternative is finding your only alternative is finding an alternative.
Right.
So you can't like rewrite it. You can't adjust the code to fix something about it. You don't even know how the internals necessarily work.
Hello Windows Vista. What? You know, that and none of these issues are not concerns with closed source
Or
stuff.
yeah, unique to open source. Yeah.
Right. So um, don't think we're saying that, but um, these do have things because what I've run across is some people think open source, and they'll talk about it. Oh, it's open source. I don't have to worry about it. Well, yeah, you kind of do because things happen. I've seen a lot of things happen. So let's talk about some of the specifics of things that have gone bad in open source. Namely, disappearing acts and bad actors. So this is uncommon. It's rare, but it does happen, and some of them are pretty interesting stories. Some of them are kind of nasty stories, but let's talk about them anyway. So one of the things that happened just in this past October was the UA parser JS npm was hacked. That repo was hacked, and it put out releases that had crypto miners and trojans included in them, and that went to a lot of people, and it was really bad. So, and this just happened in October. So the open source community doesn't have this all figured out yet. It can, it's not perfect. There's a lot of things that have been helped along. Like Bundler has the checker to make sure that you're getting the right version of things, and what's it checking the SHA-5 or I can't remember what it's checking now, but
I mean, it's basically code signing stuff.
yeah.
To some
So there's
extent.
code signings happening, and there's other things that are kind of trying to keep things on track, but it's never going to be perfect. And as has been since the advent of computers, the smarter anti-hackers get, the smarter the hackers get, and it's just a leapfrog game. But so the stuff still gets hacked, and that happened in October, and it was a big deal. One of the other things that happened, and this was going back and reading more about this was kind of nostalgic for me because I was around when this was going on. But back in 2009, a Rubyist, a really popular Rubyist by the name of Why the Lucky Steph, just disappeared overnight. Just everything gone. Like his Twitter went away, all his websites went away, his repos, everything just boom. People woke up in the morning and he was not there anymore. Cyber suicide. And that was a big deal because he had written a lot of things that a lot of people were really dependent upon, like the Hprocot. I never could say that. Hprocot, which was kind of a precursor to Nokogiri. It was the HTML parser everybody used before Nokogiri came along.
You notice a trend here.
Yeah.
Nokogiri has a lot of security releases. This HTML parser, the UA parser JS. There's a lot of parsers.
Yeah. Imagine that. But he also had written this book called Wise Poignant Guide to Ruby, which was kind of aimed at younger programmers. And it was a fantastic book. At least I thought so. And he made a site called Hackety Hack that was geared towards teaching younger people to program. He was very into getting more people to learn programming. But all that stuff just went away overnight. Now, a lot of it's back now, but you can imagine that, this guy had a huge following. A lot of people used the stuff that he produced, and it just disappeared. So, and like Hprocot and the Hackety Hack were free. I don't know if Hackety Hack was really open source. It was free, but I don't know that it was open source. But Apricot was just a Rails gem, open source Rails gem, and a lot of people used it. I was using it, and it just went away. And it's not like he stopped updating it. It went away. Like he shut his repos down.
Yeah, but I mean, so in that scenario, you still got the version that
Sure,
you're
yeah.
using in your app.
It's not like your stuff stopped working. It's just that
Yeah.
you couldn't go pull the latest code because it was gone. So you better hope you got the latest stuff before it disappeared. It wasn't quite that bad. I mean, it was open source, but it freaked a lot of people out. And then, more recently, we've got a thing that kind of, all right, I'm going to be soapboxy and judgy about this one, but this whole thing with Marek Squire, the colors.js and faker.js mess.
Mm-hmm.
So this guy, the colors.js and the faker.js got released as open source under the MIT license, which basically means anybody can use this for whatever purpose for free forever. That's how it was released, right? And he stopped updating it years ago, which is fine. Like colors.js doesn't really need an update. It's not, nobody's inventing new colors. So that's not really a problem. But what happened was when was this, like 2 or 3 weeks ago, something like that, maybe a month, he actually corrupted his own stuff and put releases out. So when people updated, it just destroyed things. Well, destroyed their products because he basically put his stuff to run in an infinite loop that would just put garbage on the screen when it was loaded.
Okay.
So it was really nasty, and he did this to his own stuff. And apparently, the reason he did this for his own stuff is he felt that companies were making money off of his freeware, and he should be paid for it. And so he just destroyed everything. In 2020, he did a post where he said, "Respectfully, I am no longer going to support Fortune 500s and other smaller sized companies with my free work. Take this as an opportunity to send me a 6-figure yearly contract or fork the project and have someone else work on it." I mean, fine. If you don't want to maintain it anymore, you're not beholden to anybody. It's a gift. But that's like, you don't give somebody a gift and then 3 years later say, "Okay, now pay me for that." I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but that was a dick move. And what really got me is that if you look at the issues tab in these repos, more so in the colors than the faker, I think, but there's a lot of issues in there, and there are a lot of people supporting this move, a lot of people condemning it, but a lot of people supporting it and basically saying, well, he should be paid for his work. Well, yeah, you should be paid for work that you're hired to do. But if you want to do open source stuff and release something as open source, don't be bitter if somebody uses it. I mean, that's just, I don't know. And don't support that kind of activity, because all that does is make people distrust open source, and it's bad for the open source movement and the open source community. It's not doing anybody any favors, and that's an example of just a bad actor. That was, in my opinion, immaturity and selfishness. And I get that, developers should be compensated for their work when they're hired to do a job. I'm all for that. I'm a developer. I want a paycheck, sure. But if I'm going to do open source stuff, I understand it's open source. You take it. If I give you an MIT license on it, do with it what you will. It's a gift. And if I run into hard financial times, that doesn't mean I can come back here and jack you up and hold you hostage and blackmail you into giving me money because I once gave you a gift. I don't know. Anyway, soapboxy, but that kind of stuff happens. And those are things you have to be wary of in the open source field. Now, that could happen in closed source too, but that would absolutely destroy a business. I don't think that I've ever seen that happen, really. Because the people would just stop buying their crap.
So I think we should probably talk about some like mitigation for some of this stuff.
Right.
Because like what I'm thinking about is I think the number one way to mitigate some of this is, of course, tests.
Oh, absolutely.
So if you go to upgrade something and it breaks your stuff, okay, then your app won't be affected because you'll catch it and it won't be deployed.
Right.
So that's the number one form of mitigation, is having like you like to say, you must have tests, or you're a fan of test-driven development.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the first form of mitigation. But secondly, it is open source. So not that small organizations would do this, but if you are a large organization that is committed to using a fair amount of open source, you would have the resources to have some sort of engineering or process in place to do diffs of libraries. And you can investigate to say, okay, we're going to go from this version to this version. What's the diff of it, the difference in the two versions? And has anything been introduced we don't like? So you could do a full security audit of the code because, again, it's open source if you chose to do that.
Right. Yeah, and even if you're a small company or you're a one-man operation or something, you still should have that code. Because worst case scenario, it goes away. Well, at least you can do something about it. Or you might be able to hire somebody to come in and deal with it and repackage it or something. So make sure you have the code, which, with Ruby on Rails and Bundler and stuff, you always have the code for gems because it downloads it. But, that's not always the case in other languages and environments. So just make sure you get your open source stuff if you're doing open source. That's the best way to mitigate it, because, yeah, it may be a little expensive to fix it, but at least you can fix it.
Right.
And that's the big deal.
Do you have any other mitigation strategies you can think of?
One of the things that I do is about once a month, I'll kind of go through. I run the Bundler Outdated gets run a lot, and we have the automated CVE detectors and stuff for Bundler and all that stuff running on our CI/CD. So we're kind of protected against that stuff, and we kind of know when things are going out of date, if they're being maintained. But then once a month, I like to kind of go look at most of our bigger gems, especially the ones that are in the production set, and just take a quick look at the code repos at the GitHubs and see, okay, when was the last time this was updated? 10 years ago? Okay. Do I care? Maybe, maybe not. If I'm still using something and it hasn't been updated in 10 years, I'm probably fine. But if it's been 2 years since it's been updated, I may want to start taking a look at, okay, is this going to be problematic when the next version of Ruby and or Rails comes out? And what alternatives do I have if it is? So get prepared ahead of time and keep an eye on the open source stuff you use to see what directions it's going.
Yeah, but some of that's also, I think there's still the potential to get burned by some dependencies.
Oh, sure.
Too. So, you may be using a gem, but you are not intimately aware that maybe one of its dependencies is having an issue or hasn't
Right.
been updated, or it's a dependency that has a narrow restriction on the gem versions allowed and it hasn't been updated in a while, therefore you can't move forward, you know.
Right. Yeah, you can't completely 100% avoid all of these issues, but you can kind of reduce the exposure you have and the footprint of the problem if you kind of stay on top of it as you go. And if you're prepared for, okay, these things might happen. What do I do if these things happen? Well, I have a couple of alternatives in my back pocket. You know, they weren't my first choice, but I can make them work if things go completely pear-shaped here. For sure have tests. And I'm telling you, this crap with the colors.js and the faker.js, I'm not really feeling terribly well. I mean, I feel bad for the businesses. That was a dick move. But if they'd had tests, it wouldn't have been a big a damn deal as it was, because they would have caught it before it ever went into the public.
Now,
So,
I didn't read a whole lot of articles on this. Were there actual sites that had
oh yeah,
significant?
oh yeah, and you know, in that case, you got nobody to blame but yourself. You should have been doing tests. It's not like test-driven development is a new fangled thing here. It's been around for a long time.
Although apparently they're not teaching it at some institutions.
Oh God, no, not at all. But you know, that's another thing to mitigate a lot of these problems. A lot of problems you would ever have is have tests, automated tests for your stuff. That solves so many issues. I'm probably just going to say that every freaking episode, because every time we talk about a problem, it's, well, did you have a test? Why don't you have a test? Good grief. Hold on, I'm going to step down off my soapbox here. All right, so anyway, yeah, but you know, the moral of the story is be aware that open source stuff isn't just magical and 100% safe and harmless. Bad things can and do happen. That doesn't mean you shouldn't use open source, because closed source bad things can and do happen. But there seems to be the developers that I talk to a lot, there seems to be this complacency about open source and how dangerous it can be if you don't pay attention to what you're doing with it. So, you know, just be prepared. Think about it when you start bringing open source stuff into your app. Analyze it, take a look at it, and say, is this actually a wise move? Do I have a potential for big problems here? You know, if you're doing something like some innocuous little gem that just is a little helper thing, that may not be a big deal. But if you're doing something that's, like Devise, that's handling all your authentication, and something goes pear-shaped with that, that's a problem. And so you want to think, well, is this a good plugin? Is this good open source project? Is it well supported? Has it been around a while? Is it community approved, basically? That doesn't answer all the questions, but it's a good start. And
yeah, because going back to the Rue example, it is still listed as one of the top gems for working with, CSV or Excel
right.
files.
And I used it in 3 different projects over my career. It's not like it's you found this little thing in your corner of the world. It's a big gem, or it was. And it happens, technology changes, people grow up, get married, have kids, they can't do this stuff anymore, they can't spend all their time. But, just be prepared. Now, on the flip side of the coin, if you're a company, especially if you're a big company and you're using a bunch of open source, and the open source author has like a buy me a coffee thing or something, buy him a cup of coffee. I mean, be cool. Come on. They're giving their talent away here. It's much appreciated, but let's support them too, because they're essentially supporting us. It's symbiotic relationship. So the more businesses support them, and if you're a bigger business, I mean, give them a sponsorship or something. Do if you can afford that kind of stuff, give back to them a little bit. They're busting their butts here, and they're doing really, really cool things. A lot of which is much better than the closed source for profit software is doing a lot of times. So, support that. If you're an open source dev, um, don't be a dick about things. It's just play nice, okay? We appreciate it, but play nice. Anyway, I know that was all preachy and soapboxy and stuff from an old grumpy fart, but I just that whole colors.js thing really just frosted my cheese. Anyhow, if you guys enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Mash all the buttons and ding all the bells. Join us every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern for more Dev Talk. Next week, we'll be talking about some refactoring techniques. And if you have a topic idea that you would like to see on the show, please leave it in the comments below. You can catch our podcast at all the places that podcasts live. Visit rubberduckdevshow.com to sign up for our newsletter and see all our episodes. And follow us on Twitter at DuckyDevShow. Until next time, happy programming.
Happy programming.
Bye.
Bye.